Woman refuses to rent to Elon Musk. What happens next leaves her speechless. The sound of heels clicking against the hardwood floor echoed through the grand foyer of the townhouse. Sylvia Adams, a sharp-featured woman in her early 50s, adjusted the silk scarf around her neck and glanced at her watch. It was nearing 3 p.m., and her next appointment was running late. She let out an audible sigh of impatience, the kind she had perfected after years of dealing with tenants she deemed beneath her standards. Sylvia prided herself on maintaining a certain level of clientele for her rental properties. The idea of renting to just anyone was abhorrent to her. No, her tenants had to meet her stringent requirements, not just on paper but also in demeanor, dress, and, if she were being honest, pedigree. Her assistant, a timid young woman named Marcy, peeked her head around the corner. "Ms. Adams," she began nervously, clutching her tablet. "The gentleman for the 3 o'clock appointment just arrived." He's here." Sylvia raised an eyebrow, sensing the hesitation in Marcy's voice. "And," she prompted, her tone clipped. Marcy shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting toward the front door. He's not exactly what I expected." Sylvia rolled her eyes. "What does that even mean? Does he not own a suit?" "Honestly, Marcy, I don't pay you to be vague." Before Marcy could stammer out a response, the front door opened, and in walked the man in question. He was tall, with an unassuming posture and an air of quiet confidence. His suit, while tailored and impeccably clean, lacked the ostentation Sylvia typically expected from someone interested in renting her high-end property. "Good afternoon," the man said, his tone polite but neutral. He extended a hand toward Sylvia, who hesitated for just a moment before shaking it, her expression carefully guarded. "Elon," he introduced himself simply. Sylvia blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the name. She quickly recovered, her practiced smile snapping into place. "Mr. Musk," she said smoothly. "Welcome. I must admit, I wasn't expecting you in person. Usually, individuals of your status send an assistant or representative." Elon's expression remained unreadable. "I prefer to handle things directly when it comes to housing," he replied. "A home is personal, after all." Sylvia tilted her head, her smile faltering just slightly. Something about his tone, so calm, so unassuming, put her on edge. She gestured toward the living room, her movements sharp and deliberate. "Shall we?" she said, leading him into the space. The living room was designed to impress, with floor-to-ceiling windows, custom-built shelves lined with tasteful decor, and a fireplace that looked more for show than actual use. Sylvia glanced over her shoulder as Elon followed her in, noting how his gaze swept over the room with quiet interest but without the awe she had come to expect from potential tenants. "This property," she began, slipping into her rehearsed pitch, "is one of the most exclusive rentals in the city. It boasts 5 bedrooms, 4 bathrooms, a state-of-the-art kitchen, and a private terrace with a stunning view of the skyline." Elon nodded thoughtfully, his hands clasped behind his back. "Impressive," he said simply. Sylvia frowned inwardly. Most prospective tenants would have jumped in with questions, perhaps even a compliment about her taste in interior design. But Elon seemed disinterested, not dismissive, but not eager to impress her either. She didn't like it. "Of course," she continued, her tone sharpening slightly, "a property of this caliber isn't for everyone. We have a very rigorous vetting process to ensure that only the most qualified candidates are considered." Elon raised an eyebrow, a hint of amusement flickering in his eyes. "Qualified in what sense?" Sylvia allowed herself a thin smile. "Financially, of course, but also culturally. This is a very exclusive neighborhood, Mr. Musk. We take great care to ensure our tenants fit into the character of the community." Marcy, who had been hovering near the doorway, winced at Sylvia's words. Elon, however, didn't react. He simply nodded as if he'd expected as much. "I see," he said. "And what exactly does the character of the community entail?" Sylvia hesitated, caught off guard by the question. She was used to potential tenants nodding along, eager to please. Elon's calm inquiry felt more like a challenge, though his tone remained polite. Well, she said, choosing her words carefully, we value discretion, respectability, and, how shall I put this? A certain level of refinement. The air in the room grew heavier, the tension almost imperceptible but undeniable. Elon held her gaze, his expression unreadable. And you determine refinement how, exactly, he asked, his tone mild. Sylvia felt her confidence waver for the first time. We have a thorough application process, she said briskly. References, credit checks, background reviews. All standard procedures. Elon nodded again, his gaze steady. I see. Sylvia cleared her throat, eager to regain control of the conversation. Of course, for someone of your stature, I imagine most of those steps would be unnecessary. Your reputation speaks for itself, doesn't it? The words, meant to flatter, landed awkwardly in the space between them. Elon didn't respond immediately, and the silence stretched just long enough to make Sylvia uncomfortable. I appreciate the sentiment, he said finally, but I believe everyone deserves the same consideration, regardless of their status. Sylvia's smile tightened. Of course, she said quickly, but I must admit, Mr. Musk, I find it unusual that someone in your position would be looking to rent rather than buy. May I ask why? Elon tilted his head slightly, his expression thoughtful. I value flexibility, he said simply, and I believe a home is about the people in it, not just the building itself. Sylvia's practiced smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Something about his response, so unpretentious, so direct, left her momentarily at a loss for words. She quickly recovered, her tone turning brisk. Well, I'll need to review your application, of course, she said. But I must warn you, we're very selective. I can't make any promises. I wouldn't expect you to, Elon replied, his tone even. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence, the air thick with unspoken tension. Sylvia glanced at Marcy, who was doing her best to appear invisible, and then back at Elon, whose calm demeanor seemed almost unshakable. Well, Sylvia said finally, forcing a bright smile. Why don't we continue the tour? There's plenty more to see. Elon nodded, gesturing for her to lead the way. After you, he said, his tone polite but firm. As Sylvia turned to leave the room, her mind raced. Something about this man unnerved her, though she couldn't quite put her finger on why. All she knew was that he wasn't like her usual tenants, and she wasn't sure she liked it. Sylvia led the way up the grand staircase, the heels of her designer shoes clicking sharply against the polished wood. The air between her and Elon felt heavier now, the tension from their earlier exchange lingering like a cloud. She tried to shake it off, reminding herself of who she was, a successful landlord with an impeccable reputation. If this man thought he could intimidate her, he was sorely mistaken. This is the master suite, Sylvia announced as they entered the spacious bedroom. She gestured toward the oversized windows that framed a stunning view of the city skyline. As you can see, it's one of the finest features of the property. The light in the morning is simply exquisite. Elon stepped into the room, his movements unhurried. He glanced around, taking in the tasteful but somewhat ostentatious decor. It's nice, he said, his tone neutral. Sylvia blinked, her smile faltering. Nice? That was all he had to say? Most prospective tenants would have been gushing by now, praising her impeccable taste and the sheer luxury of the space. But Elon's subdued reaction grated on her nerves. I should hope so, she said, her tone sharper than she intended. This property is one of the most sought after in the neighborhood. People wait months just for a chance to see it. Elon nodded, his gaze drifting to the window. And how many people actually get approved? He asked casually. Sylvia's lips pressed into a thin line. Only the most qualified, she said. I have a reputation to uphold, you understand. I can't just let anyone move in. Elon turned to face her, his expression unreadable. Of course, he said simply. For a moment, Sylvia felt as though she were being scrutinized, as though Elon could see straight through her carefully constructed persona. She didn't like it. She needed to regain control of the conversation. This suite also features a walk-in closet and an ensuite bathroom with heated floors, she said briskly, gesturing toward the adjoining rooms. It's designed for someone who truly appreciates the finer things in life. Elon stepped toward the closet, peering inside. I'm sure it's perfect for the right person, he said, his tone still calm but slightly distant. Sylvia bristled at the comment, hearing an unspoken implication that irritated her. She crossed her arms, her gaze narrowing slightly. I must say, Mr. Musk, you're quite understated for someone in your position, she said, her voice laced with forced politeness. Elon raised an eyebrow. And what position is that? Sylvia hesitated, caught off guard by the question. Well, she said, recovering quickly, you're one of the most influential men in the world, aren't you? I'd have thought you'd be used to a certain level of, how shall I put this? Luxury. Elon's lips curved into a faint smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. Luxury is subjective, he said. What matters to me is functionality. Sylvia tilted her head, her smile turning icy. How practical of you, she said, her tone dripping with condescension. But practicality doesn't always align with exclusivity, does it? Elon's gaze didn't waver, but there was a subtle shift in his posture, a quiet strength that made Sylvia feel as though she were the one being tested. She cleared her throat, eager to move on. Shall we continue? She said, turning sharply on her heel and heading toward the hallway. There's still plenty to see. As they descended the staircase, Marcy hovered nervously near the base, clutching her tablet like a lifeline. Sylvia shot her a withering glance, silently reprimanding her for standing idle. Marcy flinched and quickly busied herself with pretending to check something on her screen. When they reached the living room again, Sylvia gestured toward a sleek, modern kitchen just beyond. The kitchen is, of course, state-of-the-art, she said. Top-of-the-line appliances, custom cabinetry, and a built-in wine cooler. Perfect for entertaining. Elon walked over to the kitchen, his hands clasped behind his back as he examined the space. Do you do a lot of entertaining? He asked, his tone casual. Sylvia blinked, caught off guard by the question. Well, not personally, she said, but many of my tenants do. It's expected in a neighborhood like this. Elon nodded thoughtfully. So the tenants are expected to maintain a certain image? Absolutely, Sylvia said, her voice firm. This is an exclusive community, Mr. Musk. We have standards to uphold. And who decides what those standards are? Elon asked, his tone still calm but probing. Sylvia hesitated, her composure faltering for just a moment. I do, she said finally, her chin lifting slightly. As the property owner, it's my responsibility to ensure that the tenants are a good fit for the community. Elon tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady. And what happens if someone doesn't fit? Sylvia's smile turned brittle. Then they don't get approved, she said. It's as simple as that. The tension in the room thickened, the air heavy with unspoken words. Marcy, still hovering near the doorway, looked as though she wanted to disappear. The faint sound of a clock ticking filled the silence, each second stretching longer than the last. Finally, Sylvia clapped her hands together, forcing a bright smile. Well, she said, I think that concludes the tour. I'll review your application and get back to you within the next few days. Elon didn't move. I'd prefer to discuss it now, he said evenly. Sylvia's smile froze, her eyes narrowing slightly. I'm afraid that's not how I do things, she said. I need time to evaluate all the candidates thoroughly. I understand, Elon said, his tone polite but firm. But I'd still like to hear your thoughts. Sylvia hesitated, the control she'd so carefully maintained slipping through her fingers. She glanced at Marcy, who quickly looked away, and then back at Elon, whose calm demeanor seemed almost unshakable. Well, she said finally, her voice clipped. To be honest, Mr. Musk, I'm not sure you're the right fit for this property. Elon raised an eyebrow. Oh! Sylvia crossed her arms, her smile turning frosty. You seem unorthodox, she said carefully. This is a very traditional neighborhood, and I'm not sure your lifestyle aligns with our values. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. The crowd, small and unspoken, seemed to lean in, sensing the tension in the room. Elon's expression remained neutral, but there was a quiet intensity in his gaze that made Sylvia shift uncomfortably. "I see," he said finally, his tone calm. "And what exactly are those values?" Sylvia hesitated, caught off guard by the question. For a moment, she felt as though the ground beneath her were shifting, her carefully constructed facade cracking under the weight of Elon's steady gaze. But she wasn't ready to back down. Not yet. Sylvia tapped her manicured fingers against the kitchen counter, her carefully rehearsed smile beginning to crack under the pressure of Elon's steady gaze. She wasn't used to being questioned in her own home, well, her property to be precise. People usually deferred to her authority, especially when it came to her rentals. But this man, with his quiet confidence and infuriatingly calm demeanor, seemed intent on making her uncomfortable. "I think we're done here, Mr. Musk," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. "As I mentioned, I have other candidates to consider." Elon tilted his head slightly, his expression thoughtful. "I find it interesting," he said, his tone measured, "that you seem to have made up your mind about me before even reviewing my application." Sylvia stiffened, her fingers curling into fists at her sides. "I'm simply being thorough," she snapped. "I take my responsibilities as a landlord very seriously." "Of course," Elon said, his calm tone only serving to irritate her further. "But thoroughness usually involves facts, doesn't it? Not assumptions." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Sylvia felt her composure slipping. She glanced at Marcy, who was lingering near the doorway, her expression a mix of anxiety and discomfort. Sylvia's lips tightened. "Marcy," she said sharply, "why don't you bring me the list of other applicants? I'd like to review them now." Marcy hesitated, her gaze darting between Sylvia and Elon. Of course, Ms. Adams," she said finally, hurrying out of the room. Sylvia turned back to Elon, her smile brittle. "As you can see, Mr. Musk, I have plenty of other options. This is a very competitive market, and I have to ensure that I choose the right tenant. And you've decided I'm not the right tenant," Elon said evenly, his calm gaze never wavering. Sylvia hesitated, caught off guard by his directness. "I'm saying that I have concerns," she said, her tone defensive. "Your approach doesn't seem to align with the values of this community." Elon raised an eyebrow. "And what values are those exactly?" Sylvia faltered, her mind scrambling for a response. "Respectability," she said finally. "Tradition. This is a neighborhood with a very particular culture, and I have to ensure that my tenants fit in." "Respectability and tradition," Elon repeated, his tone thoughtful. "Those are admirable qualities. But I'm curious, how do you define them?" Sylvia's face flushed, the question catching her off guard. "I don't have to define them," she said, her voice rising slightly. "They're self-evident. And frankly, Mr. Musk, I don't appreciate being interrogated in my own home." "I'm not interrogating you," Elon said, his tone still calm. "I'm just trying to understand your perspective." Sylvia's jaw tightened. "My perspective," she said coldly, "is that I have the right to choose who lives in my property. And as I've said, I don't think you're the right fit, because I don't align with your values," Elon said, his voice steady. "Or because I don't fit into the image you have of your tenants." The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Sylvia's face reddened, her carefully constructed facade cracking under the weight of Elon's words. "This conversation is over," she said finally, her voice sharp. "You're wasting my time, Mr. Musk." Elon didn't move. He stood his ground, his calm presence a stark contrast to Sylvia's growing frustration. "If you've already made your decision," he said quietly, "then why are we still talking?" Sylvia blinked, momentarily caught off guard. Because I wanted to be polite," she stammered. But clearly that was a mistake. "Polite," Elon repeated, his tone thoughtful. "Interesting choice of words." Sylvia's face flushed with anger. "Are you accusing me of something, Mr. Musk?" "I'm not accusing you of anything," Elon said calmly. "I'm just pointing out that your actions and your words don't seem to align." The room fell into an uncomfortable silence, the tension almost palpable. Marcy returned, clutching a stack of papers, her eyes wide with nervous energy. "Here's the list of applicants," Ms. Adams, she said, her voice trembling slightly. Sylvia snatched the papers from her hands, flipping through them with an air of irritation. "Thank you, Marcy," she said curtly. "That will be all." Marcy hesitated, her gaze flickering to Elon before she quickly retreated from the room. Sylvia focused on the papers in her hands, her mind racing as she tried to regain control of the situation. "This applicant," she said, holding up one of the papers. "A young couple with excellent references and stable incomes. They've been waiting for weeks to hear back from me. And this one, an entrepreneur who owns several businesses in the area. Both of them are far more qualified than you, Mr. Musk." Elon raised an eyebrow. "Qualified in what sense?" Sylvia bristled. "In every sense," she snapped. "They're established members of the community. They have connections, reputations. They belong here. And I don't," Elon said evenly. Sylvia's lips tightened. "I'm saying that this property is better suited for someone who understands the values of this community." Elon's gaze didn't waver. "And what values are those, exactly?" Sylvia hesitated, her composure faltering once again. "I don't have to explain myself to you," she said finally, her voice cold. "This is my property, and I have the right to choose my tenants." "Of course you do," Elon said, his tone calm. "But I find it interesting that your choices seem to be based more on perception than merit." Sylvia's face flushed with anger, her frustration boiling over. "How dare you," she hissed. "You come into my home, questioning my decisions, my authority. Who do you think you are?" Elon's expression remained unreadable, but there was a quiet intensity in his gaze that made Sylvia feel as though the ground beneath her were shifting. "I'm someone who values fairness," he said simply. "And I think you do too, deep down. But it's easy to lose sight of that when you're focused on maintaining control." Sylvia opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. The tension in the room was suffocating, the weight of Elon's words hanging heavy in the air. Sylvia's frustration was boiling over, her carefully maintained poise now cracking under the weight of Elon's calm demeanor. She had always prided herself on control over her properties, her tenants, and her public image. But this man, with his maddeningly unshakable presence, was pushing her to the edge. She refused to let him see how rattled she was. "Fairness," Sylvia repeated, her voice laced with derision. "Spare me the lecture, Mr. Musk. This isn't about fairness, it's about standards. Standards that I've spent years building and maintaining. I don't need you to tell me how to run my properties." Elon didn't respond immediately. Instead, he studied her, his expression thoughtful but unreadable. It was as though he were piecing together a puzzle, and Sylvia hated the feeling of being scrutinized. "Standards are important," he said finally. "But sometimes the way we define them says more about us than the people we're judging." Sylvia's cheeks flushed with anger. "How dare you insinuate?" she began, but Elon interrupted her, his voice calm but firm. "I'm not insinuating anything," he said. "I'm just asking questions. Questions you don't seem interested in answering." Sylvia's mouth snapped shut, her anger bubbling just below the surface. She glanced at Marcy, who was once again lingering near the doorway, her face pale and anxious. "Marcy," Sylvia barked, "go make yourself useful and bring us some coffee. I'm sure Mr. Musk could use a distraction." Marcy hesitated, her gaze flickering to Elon before she nodded and scurried off. Sylvia turned back to Elon, her smile forced and brittle. "Forgive my assistant," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "She's not the sharpest, but she does what she's told." Elon's eyes darkened slightly, but he didn't take the bait. "She seems capable enough," he said. "And considerate." Sylvia scoffed, waving a hand dismissively. "Consideration doesn't pay the bills, Mr. Musk. What matters is efficiency, results. And frankly, I don't see much of that in her or in you." The words were harsh, even for Sylvia, and she knew it, but she didn't care. She was tired of feeling cornered, tired of this man who seemed determined to dismantle her authority. She needed to reassert control, no matter the cost. "I see," Elon said simply, his tone giving nothing away. Sylvia crossed her arms, her gaze narrowing. "Do you?" she challenged, Because from where I'm standing, you seem more interested in playing philosopher than actually convincing me you're a suitable tenant. Elon tilted his head slightly, his expression thoughtful. And what would convincing you look like? He asked. Sylvia hesitated, the question catching her off guard. It's not about convincing me, she said finally, her voice defensive. It's about meeting the standards I've set for this property. And those standards are based on… What? Elon asked, his calm tone somehow making the question feel sharper. Sylvia's lips tightened, her mind scrambling for a response. On experience, she said finally. I've been doing this for years, Mr. Musk. I know what works and what doesn't. Experience is valuable, Elon said, nodding slightly. But it can also make us blind to new perspectives. Sylvia let out a sharp laugh, the sound cold and humorless. Spare me the self-help platitudes, she said. This isn't about perspectives. It's about reality. And the reality is, I don't think you belong here. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. For a moment, even Sylvia seemed surprised by her own bluntness. But she didn't back down. If anything, she straightened her posture, as though daring Elon to challenge her. I see, Elon said again, his tone thoughtful. And what about this family? Sylvia blinked, caught off guard by the sudden shift in topic. What family? She asked, her voice sharp. Elon gestured toward the stack of papers on the counter, the application Sylvia had been reviewing earlier. The one you mentioned, the young couple with stable incomes. Do you know their story? Sylvia frowned, her patience wearing thin. I don't need to know their story, she said. Their financials speak for themselves. And that's enough for you? Elon asked, his tone calm but probing. Sylvia bristled, her frustration bubbling over once again. Why are you so interested in how I run my business? She snapped. This has nothing to do with you. It has everything to do with me, Elon said, his voice quiet but firm. Because it's not just about the property. It's about the people who live in it. The way we treat others says more about us than it does about them. Sylvia's cheeks flushed with anger, her composure slipping further with each passing moment. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, Marcy returned, a tray of coffee cups balanced precariously in her hands. Here's the coffee, Ms. Adams, Marcy said nervously, setting the tray on the counter. Her hands trembled slightly, causing one of the cups to wobble. Be careful, Sylvia snapped, her tone harsh. I don't need you spilling coffee all over my countertops. Marcy flinched, her face reddening. I'm sorry, Ms. Adams, she mumbled, stepping back quickly. Elon watched the exchange silently, his expression unreadable. When Marcy retreated once again, he turned back to Sylvia, his gaze steady. It seems like you're under a lot of pressure, he said quietly. Sylvia's eyes narrowed. Don't patronize me, she said, her voice cold. I'm perfectly capable of handling myself. I didn't say you weren't, Elon replied. But sometimes, the way we treat others when we're under pressure says more about us than we realize. The words landed like a blow, and for a moment, Sylvia was speechless. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her mind racing as she tried to regain control of the conversation. This conversation is over, she said finally, her voice sharp. I've made my decision, Mr. Musk, and I don't see the point in continuing this charade. Elon didn't move. He stood his ground, his calm presence a stark contrast to Sylvia's growing frustration. You're right, he said quietly. This isn't about the property anymore. It's about something much bigger. Sylvia frowned, the words unsettling her in a way she couldn't quite explain. But she didn't have time to dwell on it. She was done with this man, done with his questions and his calm, unshakable demeanor. Marcy, she called sharply. Show Mr. Musk the door. Marcy hesitated, her gaze darting between Sylvia and Elon. Are you sure, Ms. Adams? She asked timidly. Did I stutter? Sylvia snapped. Marcy flinched but nodded, stepping toward Elon hesitantly. But before she could speak, Elon raised a hand, his calm expression stopping her in her tracks. It's fine, he said quietly. I can find my own way out. Sylvia crossed her arms tightly as she leaned against the counter, watching Elon with narrowed eyes. She didn't trust the way he stood there so calmly, his demeanor unbothered despite her pointed remarks. It annoyed her, more than she cared to admit, that he wasn't groveling or trying to impress her like so many of her previous applicants had. "Well, Mr. Musk," she said, her voice sharp, "since you're still here, let me be blunt. I don't think this arrangement is going to work. You may think you're charming or persuasive, but I assure you, I'm not easily swayed by smooth talk or vague philosophies about fairness." Elon tilted his head slightly, his expression thoughtful. "I wasn't trying to charm you," he said calmly. "I was just having a conversation." Sylvia let out a sharp laugh, the sound cutting through the tension in the room. "A conversation?" she repeated mockingly. "Is that what you call it? Because to me, it feels like an interrogation. And frankly, I don't appreciate being lectured in my own home." Elon didn't respond immediately. Instead, he let her words hang in the air, his silence unnerving her more than any rebuttal could have. Sylvia's smile tightened, and she glanced toward the doorway, as though expecting Marcy to reappear and rescue her from the uncomfortable moment. When no one came, she cleared her throat and straightened her posture. "You know, Mr. Musk," she said, her tone turning icy, "I've had my fair share of difficult tenants over the years. People who think they can waltz in and take advantage of my generosity. But I've learned how to spot them a mile away. And you think I'm one of them?" Elon asked, his voice steady. Sylvia hesitated for just a moment before nodding. "Yes," she said firmly, "I do. You may have money, but money isn't everything. It doesn't buy class, and it certainly doesn't buy respect." Elon raised an eyebrow, his expression unchanging. "Interesting perspective," he said. "But respect usually goes both ways, doesn't it?" Sylvia bristled, her cheeks flushing with anger. "Don't try to twist this around," she snapped. "This isn't about me. It's about you. And from what I've seen, you don't fit the profile of someone who belongs in this neighborhood." "And what is that profile exactly?" Elon asked, his tone still calm but with a hint of curiosity. Sylvia hesitated, caught off guard by the question. "It's someone who understands the values of this community," she said finally, her voice defensive. "Someone who respects tradition and maintains a certain level of decorum." "Tradition and decorum," Elon repeated thoughtfully. "And you decide who meets those criteria?" "Yes," Sylvia said sharply. "I do. It's my property, and I have every right to choose who lives in it." "Of course you do," Elon said, nodding slightly. "But it seems like your choices are based more on perception than actual merit." Sylvia's lips tightened, her frustration bubbling over. "You're trying to make this about me," she said coldly. "But this isn't about me. It's about you. You walked in here thinking you could just snap your fingers and have whatever you wanted. That's not how the world works, Mr. Musk." "I didn't assume anything," Elon said quietly. "I came here because I thought this property might be a good fit. But it seems like you've already made up your mind." Sylvia smirked, her confidence returning as she sensed an opportunity to reassert her control. "You're right," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "I have made up my mind. And frankly, I think you'd be better off looking elsewhere. Somewhere more suitable for someone like you." The implication in her words was clear, and Elon's gaze sharpened slightly, though his expression remained composed. "Someone like me," he repeated. "And what does that mean exactly?" Sylvia hesitated, realizing too late that she had walked into dangerous territory, but her pride wouldn't allow her to back down. "Someone who doesn't understand the importance of maintaining a certain standard," she said finally, her tone defensive. "This isn't just about money, Mr. Musk. It's about character. And from what I've seen, yours leaves much to be desired." The room fell into an uncomfortable silence, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Marcy reappeared in the doorway, her face pale as she took in the scene. She opened her mouth to speak, but Sylvia cut her off with a sharp glare. "What do you want, Marcy?" Sylvia snapped. I just wanted to let you know that your next appointment is here," Marcy stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Sylvia's eyes widened in disbelief. "Already? They're early," she exclaimed, glancing at the clock on the wall. Can't anyone follow instructions these days? Marcy flinched, her gaze darting to Elon as though seeking some kind of reassurance. Should I ask them to wait? She asked timidly. Sylvia waved a hand dismissively. Yes, obviously, she snapped. And tell them not to touch anything while they're at it. Marcy nodded quickly and disappeared once again, leaving Sylvia and Elon alone in the room. Sylvia turned back to Elon, her smile brittle. As you can see, I'm a very busy woman, she said. I don't have time to entertain people who aren't serious about this property. I am serious, Elon said, his voice calm. But it seems like you're more interested in assumptions than facts. Sylvia's cheeks flushed with anger, her composure slipping further. Enough, she said sharply. I don't have to explain myself to you. This conversation is over. Elon didn't move, his calm gaze unwavering. If you're so certain, he said quietly, then why are you so defensive? Sylvia's mouth snapped shut, her face reddening. For a moment, she seemed at a loss for words, her confidence shaken by the weight of Elon's question. But she quickly recovered, her voice cold and clipped. Goodbye, Mr. Musk, she said firmly. And don't let the door hit you on the way out. Elon's expression remained neutral, but there was a quiet strength in his gaze that unsettled Sylvia more than she cared to admit. He didn't respond. He simply stood there, his calm presence a stark contrast to her growing frustration. The room fell into silence once again, the tension thick and oppressive. Sylvia crossed her arms tightly, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of the man standing before her. She didn't know what he was waiting for, but she refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her falter. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the faint ticking of a clock on the wall. Sylvia stood rigid, her arms crossed tightly, her lips pressed into a thin line. Elon hadn't moved, hadn't flinched, and that unnerved her more than she cared to admit. His calm, steady presence felt like a challenge she couldn't quite meet, and it made her blood boil. Are you still here? Sylvia snapped, her voice sharp and cutting. I thought I made myself clear, Mr. Musk. You're not getting this property. I have better things to do than entertain this charade any longer. Elon's gaze remained steady, his expression calm but unreadable. I understand, he said simply. But before I go, I'd like to ask you something. Sylvia rolled her eyes dramatically, throwing her hands in the air. Oh, for heaven's sake, she muttered. Fine. What is it? Let's get this over with. Elon stepped forward slightly, his posture relaxed but his presence commanding. Why did you get into this business, Sylvia? He asked, his tone quiet but deliberate. Sylvia blinked, caught off guard by the question. Excuse me, she said, her voice laced with irritation. This business, Elon repeated. Renting properties, managing tenants. What made you want to do this in the first place? Sylvia frowned, her brows knitting together. What does that have to do with anything? She demanded. This isn't about me, it's about you. And frankly, you're wasting my time. Maybe, Elon said, but I think it's a fair question. At some point, you must have started this business with a purpose. I'm curious what that was. Sylvia hesitated, her mind racing. She hadn't expected this. Most people didn't ask her about her motivations. They just accepted her authority as a given. I don't see how that's relevant, she said finally, her tone defensive. It's relevant because it says a lot about who you are, Elon said calmly. And the choices you make now reflect that. Sylvia's cheeks flushed with anger. I don't need a lecture from you, she snapped. I've built this business from the ground up. I've worked hard to create a reputation for excellence. I don't have to justify myself to anyone, least of all you. Elon nodded slowly, his gaze thoughtful. And part of that reputation, he said, involves judging people based on your own preconceived notions? Sylvia stiffened, her face reddening. How dare you, she hissed. You don't know anything about me or my business. I make decisions based on what's best for my properties and my community. That's all there is to it. Is it? Elon asked, his voice calm but pointed. Or are those decisions based on fear? Sylvia's jaw dropped, her eyes widening in disbelief. Fear, she repeated, her voice rising. You think I'm afraid? Of what? Of change, Elon said simply. Of seeing things from a different perspective. Of letting go of the control you've worked so hard to hold on to. Sylvia let out a harsh laugh, the sound brittle and cold. That's rich, she sneered. Coming from someone who thinks they can just walk in here and demand whatever they want. I didn't demand anything, Elon said. I just asked for an opportunity. But it seems like you've already made up your mind about me. About what I represent. Without actually getting to know me. Sylvia's hands curled into fists at her sides, her anger bubbling over. You think you're so clever, she snapped. So enlightened. But let me tell you something, Mr. Musk. This is my world. My rules. And I don't owe you anything. Elon's gaze didn't waver, his calm demeanor unshaken by her outburst. You're right, he said quietly. You don't owe me anything. But you do owe it to yourself to be honest about why you're doing this. Sylvia opened her mouth to respond. But before she could, the sound of voices drifted in from the hallway. Marcy reappeared, her face pale and anxious as she stepped into the room. Ms. Adams, she said nervously, there's someone here to see you. Sylvia frowned, her irritation deepening. I told you I'm busy, she snapped. Tell them to wait. Marcy hesitated, glancing at Elon before looking back at Sylvia. I think you should come. It's important. Sylvia let out a huff of frustration, throwing her hands in the air. Fine, she said. Let's see what's so important that it couldn't wait. She stormed toward the hallway, her heels clicking loudly against the floor. Elon followed silently, his calm presence a stark contrast to Sylvia's simmering anger. When they reached the front door, Sylvia stopped short, her eyes narrowing as she took in the scene before her. Standing on the doorstep was a well-dressed man holding a clipboard, flanked by two other individuals who looked equally professional. Behind them, a sleek black car was parked at the curb, its tinted windows gleaming in the sunlight. Ms. Adams, the man said, his tone polite but firm. I'm here on behalf of Mr. Musk. We need to discuss some discrepancies regarding your business practices. Sylvia's face paled, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to find her voice. What are you talking about? She stammered. The man glanced at Elon, who nodded slightly before turning his attention back to Sylvia. It seems there have been some complaints, the man continued. Allegations of discriminatory practices and unfair treatment of applicants. We're here to investigate. Sylvia's heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing. This is absurd, she said, her voice trembling with anger. I run my business perfectly within the law. There's no basis for these accusations. Perhaps, the man said, but we have reason to believe otherwise. And as you know, discrimination in housing is a serious offense. Sylvia's cheeks flushed with a mix of anger and panic. This is ridiculous, she spat. I have nothing to hide. Then I'm sure you won't mind cooperating, the man said smoothly. We'll need access to your records, as well as any correspondence related to your applicants. Sylvia's gaze darted to Elon, who stood silently, his expression calm but unreadable. For the first time, she felt the weight of his presence. Not as a prospective tenant, but as someone with the power to unravel everything she had worked so hard to build. You set this up, she hissed, her voice low and venomous. This is your doing. Elon's gaze remained steady. I didn't set anything up, he said quietly. I just made sure the right people were paying attention. Sylvia's fists clenched at her sides, her anger boiling over. But for the first time, she felt a flicker of something else. Fear. And she hated him for it. Sylvia's world felt as though it had shifted beneath her feet, the solid foundation she had so carefully built cracking under the weight of the accusations being leveled at her. She stared at the man with the clipboard, her mind racing as she tried to process his words. Discriminatory practices? Unfair treatment? She sputtered, her voice rising. This is absurd. I have always conducted my business with the utmost professionalism. The man raised an eyebrow, his expression calm but firm. We've received several complaints from past applicants, Ms. Adams, he said. Enough to warrant an investigation. If everything is as you say, then you have nothing to worry about, Sylvia's cheeks flushed with anger and panic. "This is outrageous," she snapped. "Who are these so-called applicants? I've never treated anyone unfairly." Elon, who had been standing silently up until now, finally spoke. "Sometimes, the truth has a way of coming to light," he said, his tone quiet but deliberate. "You may not see your actions as unfair, but perception matters. And the people you've dismissed, they have voices too." Sylvia turned on him, her eyes blazing. "You," she hissed, "this is your doing. You orchestrated this whole thing to make me look bad." Elon met her gaze, his expression steady. "I didn't orchestrate anything," he said, "but I did make sure the people you've wronged had a chance to be heard." Sylvia's fists clenched at her sides, her frustration bubbling over. "You think you're so clever," she spat, "coming in here with your calm demeanor and your high and mighty attitude. But you don't know anything about me or my business." "I know enough," Elon said simply. "Enough to see that your idea of fairness is skewed. And that's not just my opinion. It's the opinion of the people you've turned away." The man with the clipboard cleared his throat, drawing Sylvia's attention back to him. "Ms. Adams," he said, "will need access to your records to verify the complaints. If there's nothing to hide, this should be a straightforward process." Sylvia's heart pounded in her chest. She knew her records were meticulous, but she also knew they wouldn't paint the picture she wanted them to. The subtle biases she had always justified to herself as standards were now being scrutinized under a microscope, and she felt exposed. I'll need to consult with my lawyer," she stammered, her voice trembling. "I'm not providing anything without legal representation." "That's your right," the man said evenly. "But refusing to cooperate could complicate things." Sylvia glared at him, her mind racing as she tried to regain control of the situation. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in around her. Marcy, who had been hovering nervously near the doorway, stepped forward hesitantly. "Ms. Adams," she said quietly, "maybe it's time to—" "Not another word," Sylvia snapped, cutting her off. "This is my business, and I'll handle it." Marcy flinched, her face reddening as she stepped back. Sylvia turned her attention back to Elon, her eyes narrowing. "Are you happy now?" she demanded. "You've made your point, but don't think for a second that this is over." Elon's gaze didn't waver. "It's not about me being happy," he said. "It's about accountability. The choices we make have consequences, Sylvia. And sometimes those consequences catch up to us." The words landed like a blow, and for a moment, Sylvia felt the weight of them pressing down on her. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence, the tension thick and suffocating. Finally, the man with the clipboard spoke again. "Ms. Adams," he said, "we'll be in touch to arrange the next steps. In the meantime, I suggest you start reviewing your policies and procedures." Sylvia nodded stiffly, her face pale and her hands trembling. She felt as though the rug had been pulled out from under her, and she didn't know how to recover. Her reputation, her business, everything she had worked so hard to build, was now under threat, and she didn't know how to stop it. As the man and his colleagues turned to leave, Sylvia turned her attention back to Elon, her anger bubbling to the surface once again. "You think you've won," she said bitterly, "but this isn't over. I'll fight this. I'll clear my name." Elon didn't respond immediately. Instead, he studied her for a moment, his expression thoughtful but unreadable. "I hope you do," he said finally, "because in fighting this, you might just learn something about yourself." Sylvia's jaw tightened, her frustration and humiliation boiling over. "Get out," she spat. "Get out of my house." Elon nodded, his calm demeanor unshaken. "I'll see myself out," he said. "But remember, Sylvia, this isn't about me. It's about the choices you've made, and the people those choices have hurt." With that, he turned and walked toward the door, leaving Sylvia standing in the middle of the room, her world crumbling around her. For the first time in years, she felt truly powerless, and the realization was both terrifying and humbling. As the front door closed behind him, Sylvia sank into a chair, her hands trembling as she stared at the stack of papers on the counter. The faces of the applicants she had dismissed flashed through her mind, and for the first time, she felt a pang of doubt. Had she been wrong? Had her so-called standards been nothing more than an excuse to hide her biases? She didn't know. But one thing was certain, her life would never be the same. Life has a way of teaching us lessons when we least expect it. Today's story of Sylvia and Elon Musk is a perfect example of how our actions and attitudes can shape not only our lives but also the lives of those around us. If you've stayed with us this far, you've seen how Sylvia's rigid standards and quick judgments led her down a path she never anticipated. A path where she was forced to confront her own biases and behavior. Sylvia's story reminds us that power and authority are not shields against accountability. We all hold some kind of power in our lives, whether it's in our careers, relationships, or communities. And how we use that power reflects who we truly are. Sylvia believed her strict standards were about maintaining excellence, but in truth, they became a way to gatekeep and exclude. Her downfall was a wake-up call, and it's one many of us can learn from. This story challenges us to reflect on how we treat others, especially when we're in a position to make decisions that impact their lives. Do we judge people based on assumptions, appearances, or stereotypes? Or do we take the time to truly see them for who they are? Sylvia's refusal to give Elon Musk a fair chance wasn't just about one decision. It was a pattern of behavior rooted in her need for control. How often do we let our own fears or insecurities dictate how we treat others? Elon's calm and composed demeanor throughout the ordeal is also something we can learn from. He didn't retaliate with anger or aggression, even when Sylvia's behavior became outright dismissive and mean-spirited. Instead, he allowed her actions to speak for themselves, and he responded with measured words and actions. His ability to remain grounded under pressure is a reminder that strength doesn't always mean fighting back. It can also mean standing firm in your values and letting the truth reveal itself. Now, let's talk about the bigger picture. Sylvia's downfall wasn't just about one man. It was about everyone she had wronged along the way. The voices of those she dismissed and underestimated finally came together to hold her accountable. This is a powerful reminder that collective action matters. When people come together to stand up against unfairness, real change can happen. So what about you? Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you felt dismissed or underestimated? Or maybe you've been in a position like Sylvia's, where you had the power to make decisions that impacted others. How did you handle it? What did you learn? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Stories like this aren't just about one person, they're about all of us. They remind us of our capacity for growth, our responsibility to treat others with fairness and kindness, and the importance of holding ourselves accountable. If this story resonated with you, please like, share, and subscribe for more content that inspires reflection and meaningful conversations. Together, we can learn and grow from the lessons life throws our way.